Welcome back to part 3 of the trommel build. In this video, I'll be installing the electric motor that's going to drive the trommel. I'll be installing it on 2 metal surveyor stakes that will go across the trommel. Those surveyor stakes will serve as a rail system that a mounting block will be able to slide on back and forth. And I'll be able to tension the motor against a belt that's going to drive the drive wheel of the trommel. So that's the idea of the rail system, is to give the mounting block a smooth sliding system to be mounted on, so that I can slide it to be able to tension it properly. So you've already seen, if you've seen the previous videos, you've already seen the metal surveyor stakes that I'm referring to. You can see one sticking out of the trommel on the right there. That pointy metal piece that's sticking out on the right, that's one of the surveyor stakes. And the surveyor stakes are just a cheap source of metal. They're not strong metal, they're kind of brittle, but they're good enough for many applications such as this, where it's not going to be some high stress environment. It'll just be fairly low stress, and so I use them quite a lot for projects like this. At first I was using a saw bit to cut a hole out, and it turned out to be the wrong choice. I had to chisel it out and everything. The saw bit wasn't deep enough to go all the way through, so I had to do it part way through and then chisel the rest out. Took way longer than it should have. I did remember, though, that I have a paddle bit that I was able to use, and that paddle bit went significantly faster. You'll notice that when I used that saw bit on this first hole, when I tried to drive the surveyor stake through it, it was a pretty tight fit. So with this paddle bit, fortunately, not only was it large enough, but it was large enough for the surveyor stake to slide freely through that hole. And it was also a lot quicker to drill the actual hole itself. So there's the second hole on this side. You'll notice the surveyor stake goes through it super, super clean. As opposed to the one with the saw bit, where it's getting hung up and getting stuck in there. These are the actual surveyor stakes. You can see they're a lot larger than that one I was testing with. And so they'll slide across the trommel in this fashion here. So I just need to drill 2 more holes on the other side for those surveyor stakes to pass through, and then that'll be the rail system that the mounting block for the motor will be mounted on. So I just needed to duplicate those measurements over on the other side of the trommel. Hole number 1. Hole number 2. And notice now the surveyor stakes pass right through, and they mount beautifully into the frame of the trommel. So here's the rail system. At first I was picturing that it would go across the middle, and then I realized that didn't make any sense, because the drive shaft of the motor it is off to the side of the motor. So I had to put them to the side of the drive wheel for the trommel so that the pulley for the motor would align with the drive wheel for the trommel. So this is a visual of how it's going to look once it's all completed. Notice, like I mentioned, the motor's off to one side, the pulley's then gonna align with the drive wheel of the trommel. It's not a perfect alignment the way it's shown right now because it's not mounted on the block. I was just resting it on the rails. But for the final version, it'll be on this wooden block that I'm cutting out, and that'll give me flexibility to put the motor in any position that I need so that the pulley on the motor aligns with the drive wheel of the trommel. So here I'm doing a dry fit so I can identify exactly where the holes need to be so that when I mount the motor on it, it'll leave space for the belt, and the belt won't be interfered, that the wooden block underneath won't interfere with the belt. I also need to make sure that the block is lined up in such a way that I'll be able to mount the motor exactly where it needs to be so that the pulley and the drive wheel of the trommel line up. So just a little dry fitting here to get some measurements. So I'm marking the positions of where I need to drill the holes so that the block will slide along those rails. I took the measurements from the rails themselves and then transferred those measurements to the middle of the block. So the measurement was initially at the very bottom of the block, and then I just transferred those measurements to the middle using the speed square. So using that same paddle bit as before, didn't go all the way through the block, so I had to drill part way through and flip it over and drill the other side. You can see I punched through there. Took a little bit to clean out the hole completely. You'll notice that the first fitting that I did, the surveyor stake didn't go through very easily, so there was a good amount of cleaning and widening that I had to do, but ultimately cleaned it all out, and I got the block so it sits on those surveyor stakes just the way I pictured that it would. I drilled out some holes to mount the motor in the exact right spot so that it aligns with the drive wheel on the trommel. And then spent a good amount of time trying to get these bolts to go through. It turned out that the mounting bracket on the motor didn't have holes. Well, I got bolts that were too big for that particular mounting bracket, so I had to widen out the holes a little bit. And then I had to install the motor. It turns out drilling these holes and getting all the bolts to go through was a real pain. So nothing too exciting here, just decent amount of frustration trying to get this all to fit together. But ultimately got it all mounted, and now it is motorized. I just need to get a belt, and that'll be in the next video where I install the tensioners for the belt, and install the belt itself, and we'll do the first test run.